Hi, I'm Dave McFawn here with Larry Coble and Larry's Bee Yard. We're going to talk about feeders today. We're going to talk about frame or division board feeders, Boardman feeders, pail feeders, Miller feeders or high top feeders. Also feeders that go on top of the lid that we use a lot in South Carolina. All right. First feeder we're going to talk about is division board or frame feeders. They go into place of a frame in the beehive. We got two types here. Typically they need to be cleaned out once or twice a year. You should put in this type debris or something for the bees to climb on so they don't drown. They go in place of a frame in the beehive, and they go typically on the edge frame, and that way you can just move the top super box over and you're good to go. So those are the frame feeders. They're good for warm weather. In cold weather, the bees can't get to the sugar syrup in the frame feeder when the bees cluster, so they're a good warm weather feeder. The second type of feeder is the Boardman or entrance feeder. The entrance feeder is good for feeding water, but I don't recommend feeding sugar syrup with it because it may incite robbing in the colonies. It inserts in the front of the hive, and this particular one, this wooden one, you can insert a quart jar in the top to feed water, and the reason why it doesn't work well in cold weather in the winter, because when the bees cluster, they can't get to the water out here, and typically I don't use them for the winter for that reason. So this is a wooden type, this is a plastic type. They come apart, it inserts into the front of the hive, and that's a Boardman feeder. The next feeder we're going to talk about is a pail feeder. This is what I typically use. A pail feeder is good for warm and cold weather. It comes in two pieces, a lid with a screen, and then the pail, the bucket. You can put 2 to 1 or 1 to 1 sugar syrup in here, mix it up, put the lid on it, invert it over the Porter bee escape hole in the inner cover, and press the sides to create a vacuum, and you're good to go. Now, if a lot of times the bees will propolize the screen on this pail feeder, you can run it under hot tap water and it'll usually clean it out. Also, I use a paint stir to stir up. I put sugar and water in here and I stir it up with the paint stir. Makes it easy and quick to mix the syrup. So it works real well. This will work well in warm weather and cold weather. When I invert it, typically I'll put a brood box around it and a telescoping cover on top to keep straggler bees out, and it works real well. The next type of feeder is the Miller or high top feeder. It has 2 reservoirs, this particular one, with an opening in the bottom for the bees to come up through and get sugar syrup out of the reservoirs. It goes on top of the equipment stack. It's good for warm and cold weather. It's more expensive than the pail feeders. It costs typically $10 or more a copy than the pail feeder and the inner cover. So, but they work well. Fill sugar syrup up in here and then put the telescoping cover on top and you're good to go. This is another way to feed, is use a quart jar on top of 2 scrap pieces of wood, or set it over the Porter bee escape hole on top of the equipment stack. Put a deep around it and a cover, telescoping cover, and you're good to go. Now this will work well in typically during the season when the bees aren't drawing comb out. If they can get past that jar into the space here, they'll draw comb out. So you need to be careful about that. Typically they draw comb out during the nectar flow. This is another way to feed in South Carolina. It doesn't get that cold in South Carolina. Typically it gets down in the upper 20s. Very rarely it gets below that, but it does every now and then. So we have covers, telescoping covers with holes in them, and we can put a quart jar on the top of the telescoping cover and feed that way, and we can see how much sugar syrup is available to the bees as they consume it. So this is another way to do it in warm climates. We're going to talk about the Sericel feeder. This is one of the newer feeders. It's a hive top feeder, and it's textured on the part that the bees come up and get into the feed. You can feed sugar syrup, or you can feed dry sugar with these. So that's a good feeder. They're about $30 currently. This is one of the newer feeders. It's called a bee buffet. You put it over the hole of the inner cover, and you put jars of sugar syrup on here, either a pint or a quart. We've had good success with it in South Carolina. You put a box around it and put the lid on it, and you're good to go. This is one of the newer division board feeders. It has it takes the place of exactly one frame, and it has floats in it that such that when you put sugar syrup in here, it fills it up and floats come up, and the bees won't drown on you. But it takes the place of one frame. You put it in the side of the deep, and just scoot the box over, and you're good to go. It's good for warm and cold, or just warm weather. All right. This is a rapid feeder, one of the newer feeders. It has a opening in the bottom that you set over the hole in the inner cover, and the bees come up and get sugar syrup out of the feeder. It's one of the newer ones. It's a good feeder apparently, and it works fairly well. All right, let's talk about pollen feeders for a minute. Pollen feeders are usable in the autumn and the fall when there's a pollen dearth. We have pollen dearths in South Carolina. In most cases we have enough pollen, but in the fall sometimes we have pollen dearths, which may impact brood development. This is a homemade pollen feeder. The bees are, you put pollen on the inside and the bees will come out and collect the pollen sub during pollen dearth. I've also just used a bucket and nailed it to the side of a post and put pollen sub in there. I tried to feed dry pollen sub in lieu of pollen patties in southeast because of small hive beetles. If you do feed pollen patties, you want a very small pollen patty on top of the brood nest, something that the bees can get away with in a day or two, so small hive beetles don't develop. And that's pollen in a nutshell.